I don't have like a formal presentation. Brian had asked me to speak about, well, specifically about RAID 10, because there's been a lot of discussion in the community about it, and there's been no presentations done about RAID levels, and so we thought this would be a great, short little thing we could do, and Brian's so disinterested in leaving. So, so there's been a lot of talk in the community in the last 2 to 3 months. RAID has been a really hot topic, and people have been looking at what RAID is appropriate and what RAID is common, and why you use different RAID levels for servers in small business environments. Real quickly, just in case someone doesn't know, RAID is redundant array of independent disks. It is a means by which many physical disk drives can be abstracted into a single disk presented to the operating system. We use it in servers for lots of reasons. Okay. Before we get into RAID levels, something that really doesn't get discussed very much in small business environments is software and hardware RAID. It's very common knowledge in small business and in the Intel platform world that software RAID is bad, hardware RAID is good. Quite often people will say, well, hardware RAID, absolutely. Software RAID, you can't use it for an enterprise environment, it's just not appropriate. That's not actually true. In the Intel world, we have this historic position of the processors are underpowered compared to big enterprise boxes. Not currently, but previously during the late 1980s, early 1990s, that was a significant factor. And the primary platform in the Intel world is Windows. And Windows notoriously does a very, very bad job with software RAID drivers. This combination of things causes us to have underpowered systems that don't have extra horsepower necessary for handling RAID, and to have a software platform whose RAID drivers are problematic. They were flaky, they're slow, and these things are major factors when you're dealing with your storage subsystems. This is not a place where you want to have a vulnerability or performance issue. So in the small business space, quite typically what's happened is we have a 20-year tradition of people going out and getting hardware RAID to overcome these things. You don't need to worry about drivers in the operating system because it's being, the abstraction is being handled at the hardware level. There's a separate BIOS and a separate device that's presenting all that to the operating system. So that kind of takes that away from the operating system. You're very agnostic at that level, which is very handy. Hardware RAID also has its own processor, its own memory, its own firmware. And so all of the actual work of RAID, the striping, the mirroring, the calculations, are being handled by a separate device and then being handed off to the main computer. So traditionally, this was a great way to get parallel processing on underpowered Intel boxes in the early 1990s, because the main processor was left just handing off SCSI commands as usual, and the RAID controller would take care of all the heavy lifting that needed to be done for it. So traditionally, it was very important as well. Today, this is very much not the case. We have all these factors have changed. The computers are very highly powered now on average, and on average we have systems, especially in the small business space, that are so much overpowered that we have basically an unlimited amount of overhead to spend on those calculations. So that's not really a factor, and Windows has fallen to being, while still very important and still the primary operating system, it is no longer 99% of the environment. And so now we have Linux and Solaris and some other operating systems that are beginning to play in that space, who traditionally have very powerful software RAID drivers and are not limited in the same way. So the options have really changed in the small business space. Hardware RAID still has a place. It is expensive, and it is generally slower, with the exception of Windows environments, which people are surprised to hear. But there's so much more power in the base server that you can just get more out of it without using hardware RAID. If you're on Windows, that's not true because of driver problems. So we have options, and hardware RAID also has really, really easy to do hot swapping. You can pop out drives, you can pop in drives without needing anyone from the software side. So when you host a data center where you have a third party doing that stuff, it can work out really well. Okay. So given that we have those options, that's something that in a small business environment you can really play with what makes sense for your environment. Hardware RAID is going to be very often still the correct choice, but software RAID does not need to be dismissed out of hand, especially if you're running Unix boxes that are the operating system is designed from the ground up to be handling the file system and the storage subsystems natively. So you got those options now. That is also true, I should mention, if you're doing virtualization on something like Zen, which has access to the Linux subsystems, even though it's virtualized. So you may be virtualizing Windows on Linux, or not truly on Linux, Windows on Zen with a Linux controller. In that circumstance, you still have access to the Linux storage subsystem, which can handle that RAID for you and actually get you more performance at a lower cost. Okay, so given that, we have a number of traditional RAID levels, starting with RAID 0, RAID 1, RAID 2, 3, and 4 have effectively gone away. They are basically legacy at this point. I do realize that NetApp does use RAID 4. Nobody cares.
Does you?
RAID 5 and 6 are still in use. RAID 10, and then there are some really niche RAID levels that are hybrid models used above that RAID 50, 51, 100, but these really don't come into play in a small business environment. Typically, these are very, very large storage subsystems, especially something like RAID 100 that requires a minimum of 8 drives. People aren't going to do that very often. And at 8 drives, it doesn't make very much sense. You're really looking at 16 or 32 drives. Not very many SMBs are looking to have a single storage subsystem with 32 drives. So RAID 0 obviously is striping without any parity. So we can look at this for situations where we're not concerned about drive vulnerability, especially in machines that can survive downtime and have volatile data that you're not expecting to survive through a reboot, because if anything goes wrong, you're going to lose all that data. So they're very, very important. The usage scenario for RAID 0 is especially prevalent in caching servers, where the data is temporary. You can do a lot of performance there. If you lose a caching server, hopefully you can reboot and you're not concerned about the fact that you've lost drives. So it really doesn't come into play in small business because we don't have any prevalence of that type of server. In a big enterprise, RAID 0 could come in very handy because there is caching going on. Many business applications have large caching, but in the small business space, this is very uncommon. So it generally can be ruled out as an option. The options that typically make the most sense in small business traditionally is RAID 1 and RAID 5. RAID 1 is disk mirroring. You have 2 disks that are doing exactly the same thing at the same time. You have the ability to lose any one of 2 disks at any time. Everything keeps running, and you just simply need to replace that drive. They copy over and complete the mirror, and you're back to business. RAID 1 is expensive from a capacity standpoint. You lose 50% of your capacity. If you have 2 1-terabyte drives, you have 1 terabyte of usable capacity. Traditionally, this has been considered very bad, losing 50% of capacity. So companies were often cost conscious and wanted to move away from this, because most businesses traditionally were looking for more storage and weren't able to get enough. Today, that's not necessarily a major concern. Storage has become cheap. People have more storage than they can use. So that's begun to change. It's not always the case. Some people are scrambling for 24 terabytes in a single box. So it depends what your needs are. But with RAID 1, the survivability of a RAID 1 array is very, very good. The chances that both drives will fail at the same time is very, very low. Even if they're from the same batch, even if they have the same usage for their entire lives, the failure rates still are extremely unlikely to fail at the exact same moment, especially if drives are being replaced very rapidly. If you immediately replace a failed drive, you're in great shape. So RAID 1 has often been traditionally the choice of those who have really, really critical data and cannot lose it. RAID 5 is ideal for situations where you're looking to be conservative on your capacity. In a RAID 5 array, which has a minimum of 5 drives, it can scale up to huge numbers. Traditionally, 14 was not uncommon. Today, you can see them into the 20s. You only lose the capacity of 1 drive of the array. So if you had 14 1-terabyte drives, you lose the capacity of 1. You have 13 terabytes of usable space. For those who are conscious of their capacity, this works out really well. RAID 5 has some performance advantages over RAID 1 simply because the arrays get very large. But the way that RAID 5 works is that it has a stripe that goes across the disks. This stripe has to be calculated. It's very similar to a CRC. So the calculation of this is very computationally intensive. This is where hardware RAID began to become very important, because with RAID 1, the main controller, even on a slow box, could do it very, very easily traditionally. For RAID 5, this calculation, especially with a large array, was very intensive and would slow the machines down considerably. So this is where large caches and fast processors on the hardware controller were important. As the array gets larger, you get more spindles, and they can read faster, but the calculation becomes that much more intensive. So the bigger the processor mattered, the larger the array got. You couldn't just add disks and be guaranteed that you would be going faster. You could potentially cause contention issues. So RAID 5 is very effective from a capacity cost standpoint, but there are reasons why you need to think about whether or not it makes sense in your environment. One is, in a large array, you can only lose one drive. When you have disk mirroring, losing one of two drives, your chances of losing both at the same time is very low. When you get into a large RAID 5 array, the chances of losing two drives becomes much higher. Partially because you simply have many more drives. You lose one, say you had 8 to begin with, you have 7 more. If any one of those 7 fails, you've lost everything. And when the first drive fails, unlike a RAID 1 set, where both drives are doing the same thing all the time, in a RAID 5 set, things change. The RAID controller has to make up for the fact that one of the drives is missing, and it has to do a lot more calculations, so your speed plummets, and the drives that are left have to do more work. So the workload goes up per drive, increasing the chance that at that point is when you're going to suffer another failure. So the combination, unfortunately, puts them into a position where it's significantly less reliable than RAID 1, obviously dramatically more reliable than not having RAID at all. The other problem with RAID 5 or any RAID F array that has a calculated stripe in this way is that the rebuild process that has to be done in case of a drive loss situation is rather intensive. And if something was to go wrong, there's a very complicated algorithm going on. If that algorithm at any time fails, what can happen is the array controller, or the software RAID, depending on what you're using, can begin to rebuild the array. And when it does that, you have a risk that it will do so mistakenly and blow away your array. That sounds like a very rare thing. I've seen it happen firsthand. I know other people who've seen it happen firsthand. It can be the scariest thing in the world when you have a very large data set that all of a sudden, with no drives being lost, is gone. So there are times where you could lose everything. I've seen it myself on a 6-drive RAID 5 array. We had our forensics dictate to us that what appears to have happened is, in a server, long term, it was probably running for 4 years. At some point, 2 drives shook loose from the vibration of the server. Not exactly at the same time, but really close. The array controller saw the one as a failure, saw the other as a reconnection. It attempted to rebuild the array to survive, and it blew away all 6 disks. By the time we got to it, we had 6 fully functional disks, no problems whatsoever, not any data on it whatsoever. Nothing. The array controller was still okay, all 6 disks. We were able to immediately pop in a CD, build a new server, and start fresh. No hardware failures. So,
But did it happen again?
It did not happen again. We also took that server out of service within like a month. It was a good chance to shut it down. But so there are risks associated with any type of calculated stripe within an array. So that's something to be considered. When RAID 5 was first designed, when any of the striping, RAID 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, were first developed, we were in a situation where drives themselves were very, very volatile. The chance of any hard drive surviving 5 years was relatively low, maybe 60%. When you put 8 of them into an array, you were basically guaranteed that 1 to 3 of those were going to fail within any 4 to 5 year period. Because of that, the failure rates of drives being very high, the failure rate of array controllers kind of came in as background noise. You would lose arrays so commonly that this wasn't a factor. But today, drives tend to be extremely reliable, and we use them in ways that are even more reliable, and we treat them better, we put them in better conditions, we temperature control them better. So now having an array of 8 drives going 5 years is completely common. In fact, we would generally be pretty shocked to lose 1 of 8 drives within 5 years. So now the drives are consistently maintaining themselves, having array failures at about the same rate we did 10, 15 years ago, has moved from background noise to being a relatively significant factor in the reliability of those types of arrays. So that's a factor that's just changed over the last 15 years, just because of drive manufacturing and the size of arrays. It used to be that it was very hard for a small business to go over 6 drives because the most common servers were only 2 to 6 drive capacity, the DL380s, for example. The most common drive within that that range, maxed out at 6 drives. So those are the size arrays we saw commonly at their max. Today, those same server lines are shipping with 8 to 16 drive capacity. There are ones in the enterprise space. It's very easy to get 8s, 14s, 12s, 16s, and Dell is now shipping 24, I think. So that's 24 in a 2U that a small business can definitely afford. So you're dealing with really, really large numbers of drives. When you put them into those arrays, you have a lot of risks. Often you'll have 2 or 3 RAID F arrays in there.
Is there certain drives that you prefer, like the SAS drives or SATA, or which ones do you find work better?
When it comes to RAID, SATA or SAS drives are really going to be the same. From a functioning within the array standpoint, when you're dealing with choosing which ones to purchase, I guess what I'm trying to say is the RAID array itself is not a significant factor. If you would make a decision to use SATA based on reliability or on capacity or cost or performance, the same decision would be made whether you're RAID array or not. So SATA drives, typically 5400, 7200, or 10K now, are available and are slightly less reliable than their SAS competitors from the same vendors, which are typically available in 10 and 15K. So SAS is faster. Even at the same spindle speed, you'll get a little bit better performance out of SAS, but very, very close. So the 10K SATA drives and the 10K SAS drives are basically comparable. But cost and capacity are very big factors there. So if you're looking for 1 terabyte drives, you really can't get those in SAS. You'll have to go with SATA. Reliability, technically SAS is more reliable than SATA, but SATA has become so reliable that those numbers are really beginning to be moving towards background noise. Especially in the small business environment, chances are they're not significant factors, and the cost difference is so large, sometimes 50%, even within enterprise drives. And if you're moving away from enterprise drives towards prosumer SATA, you can sometimes cut 80 or 90% per drive in cost, which for many small businesses is well worth it. Going from a likely mean time between failure of 10 years to 8 years may not be a factor at all. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I want you to go into more of a tangent.
Okay.
Kind of a similar topic. What about form factor size? Equivalent size, speed.
Right.
Speed.
So the 2 big form factors today. The question is, what about form factors? 2 primary form factors today are 2.5-inch SFF drives and 3.5-inch LFF drives. Across the board, what you will find is that the 2.5-inch drives are more expensive and they have lower capacity. But they have the same speed, they have higher reliability because they have less arm movement, and they have less vibration, they draw less power, and they generate less heat, which is really just a factor of the draw.
What about solid state drives?
Okay, I'll get right back to those. So in an enterprise environment, if you have the cache, SFF drives are preferable generally. But because capacity of LFF drives are higher, and because the cost, it is more cost effective to use them, they can make a lot of sense too. So I really think, much like SAS and SATA, it's not a do and don't kind of situation. It's a really looking at which costs, which sizes, which chassis make sense for your environment. So the SAM SD, which I work with quite extensively, 14 LFF drives, that gives us 28 terabytes in a 2U chassis. You can't really do that with 2.5s. But if what you're looking for is performance, quite often that's how you're going to get 16 or 24 drives in a 2U, is by going to the 2.5s. And you'll get more spindles. So if you're putting in just loads of 15K spindles to see how much virtualization you can push out of a 2U box, then the 2.5s are going to make more sense. And they're going to let you have smaller power supplies, and your data center is going to heat you less. So solid state drives. Solid state drives almost universally come in 2.5-inch. You can get them in different things, but it's really just housings. Today, there's been a lot of discussion about this. Solid state drives really are reliable today. Good enterprise solid state drives dramatically outperform any type, even SAS drives, sometimes by factors of 10 to 20 times their reliability. The reliability of enterprise solid-state drives are so high that many shops are recommending not using RAID simply because it's not cost-effective when your drives are that much faster and that much more reliable. They can survive heat better, they can survive shock, thousands of times. You know, a typical drive, a drop 6 feet onto concrete will typically destroy a normal SAS or SATA drive. A solid-state drive, especially an enterprise drive, they've been known to fall off skyscrapers and survive. And all you have to do is replace the chassis. So it's not guaranteed by any stretch. I would suggest it with your enterprise data, but they really do. The chances that you're going to lose a solid-state drive compared to a traditional one is very low, and their performance characteristics are very good in the expensive enterprise drives. You're getting very fast read, fast write. The write speeds typically are only a little bit better than good traditional drives, but the read speeds are generally extremely fast. So that's one of the reasons that they're moving away from RAID, simply because you're getting all the things that you normally use RAID for out of single drives. And then large shops with the budgets are going to RAID arrays of solid-state drives, which is really awesome. And then of course, there's a lot to talk about in storage. Are you taking notes? Because you're doing backup.
I'm doing backup. You're doing storage.
I am doing storage. Am I taking notes? Apparently not.
We're taking video.
Yes, I'll watch this later to figure out what I'm talking about in Spice World. So what's happening, especially in the Solaris space and large enterprise storage boxes, is that they're starting to do hybrid systems, because the capacity advantage of traditional hard drives is very large. 2 terabytes is pretty easy to get today, and I think 3 terabytes is due. It might even be on the but pretty expensive. So large RAID systems, large storage systems from vendors like Oracle and NetApp are going to have a bulk of traditional hard drives with spindles that are handling secondary storage needs, the storage needs that typically are not being used every few seconds but might be used every few minutes, and putting in solid state to be really high performance front end caches for that. So the data that's being written and read very, very quickly on a constant basis is going to be moved into the solid state, while more archival is moved out to the actual hard drives. So with that, if you have a large amount of storage but need performance, that can be very cost effective, where you're getting 90% of the capacity of traditional drives with 90% of the performance of solid state drives in a single chassis. And I know that file systems like ZFS on Open Solaris are doing that transparently. So that's not something that's, we're not talking some really complex thing. We're not talking even about commercial products. We're talking about open source from people like Oracle. You can have that today for free in your environment.
Are you at a saving point? Because maybe we should grab the pizza while it's still warm.
We'll take a break there and come back. Sure.
While the pizza's still warm, you might as well.
Yeah. Get the button in the middle.
It's fat-free too.
Yeah, fat-free pizza. So we left off, we talked about a number of different topics around storage. Those were kind of tangents. We're going to come back to, we were at RAID 5. So RAID 6 is a technology based off of RAID 5. Works exactly the same way. The only difference is that instead of having one calculated block for every block stripe within the stripes, there are 2. And by having double parity, what this allows is that any 2 drives within the array can fail, and the array can still survive. So all the other characteristics are almost exactly like RAID 5. The same performance hits, the same everything really apply. The things that are different, instead of a minimum of 3 drives, you have to have a minimum of 4 drives. Instead of losing the capacity of one of your drives, you lose the capacity of 2 of your drives. The performance hit is approximately double. Instead of having the performance of 8 spindles minus 1 in an 8 array to give you 7 spindles of performance minus the calculation overhead, you lose 2 spindles, so you would have 6 with double the performance overhead being taken away. So RAID 6 is very unpopular in performance sensitive applications, because it typically does slow down a lot. But if you have more critical archival style data, it does get used because it is a little bit more reliable. But of course, it has double parity calculations, which means there are twice as often passing through the algorithm that may count. So you have the same risks that you have with RAID 5 that are often overlooked. In RAID 6, augmented a little bit. So it doesn't always work out as the best option. But being able to lose any 2 drives is very flexible. So the chances of losing a RAID 6 array based on a loss of drives is very, very low.
I guess, what have you seen as an adoption rate for RAID 6 versus others? I mean, is it low, high?
I have seen adoption rates of RAID 6 be extremely low, with a lot of people talking about it. Because it suffers, most people when they're doing RAIDs, especially in the small business space, are typically doing very small arrays. A lot of people doing RAID 5 are doing it with 3 drives, which is basically a no-no, because the performance is so bad, the loss percentage is so high, except for in the Apple space where they like mandate it, basically. But generally, the rule of thumb is no fewer than 5 drives, and even then you're kind of pushing your luck. With RAID 6, it would be the same thing, all the numbers 1 higher. Well, yeah, you do it with 6 drives, but really you'd be looking at 7 or 8 drives where it starts to make sense. Partially because a lot of small business servers don't support RAID 6. That knocks it out quite often. And a lot of places just don't want to spend the money on RAID 6 because it's so much more expensive than RAID 5, both in performance hits and in the number of drives you have to purchase. It loses that the cheap advantage of RAID 5. The other RAID level that's very critical in the small business space is RAID 10. RAID 10 is not truly its own RAID level. RAID 10 is actually an amalgamation of RAID 1 and RAID 0 together. So what happens in RAID 10 is you have a series of RAID 1 sets, as few as 2, and pretty much as many as you can get away with. So each one of those RAID sets is a true RAID 1 set. It's 2 drives working together, mirrored all the characteristics of traditional RAID 1. You then take a number of those RAID 1 sets and you apply a RAID 0 stripe over them. This can be done in 2 ways. The way that we see that as RAID 10 is to actually get an array controller that can handle RAID 10, and it does it all under the hood. It simply calls it a RAID 10 or a RAID 1 plus 0 set, and it takes care of it from there. You sometimes see this mislabeled by HP as 0 plus 1. HP doesn't actually do that. There is a thing called 0 plus 1, and it's not RAID 10, and it doesn't have the performance characteristics or the reliability characteristics of RAID 10. And I have no idea why HP mislabels that, because they certainly do not do it in their enterprise systems. So there's some naming convention issue there. But so you can do it all within a controller that supports RAID 10, or you can have a number of controllers, and no one really does this, but you can have a number of hardware controllers that do RAID 1, and then take software RAID 0 and apply it over the top. That would be awkward and very difficult to manage in that situation, but it's something you can certainly do. You can build your own conglomerate-style RAID arrays if you wanted to. What's nice about RAID 10 is the performance is phenomenal because you start with a minimum of 4 drives, but it can scale up to very large numbers. It works very well in the 8 and 16 and 24 bay servers that are common today. With RAID 10, you don't have the calculation that you do with RAID 5 and RAID 6. So that entire piece is taken out. So you have a huge performance advantage from a calculation standpoint. You also have a lot of spindles. So when you're doing a read operation on RAID 10, you get better performance than you would with RAID 1, 5, 6, anything. You're at your absolute maximum, except for RAID 0, which simply always wins in performance and always loses reliability. So with RAID 10, you really are getting amazing read performance, and your write performance will not always match RAID 5 and RAID 6. There are times where those will outperform it, especially RAID 5. RAID 6 is pretty hard pressed. But its write performance is very competitive with the fastest technology competitors for it. So it's a really good balance. But because it doesn't have the hits on the system, it can have a lot of performance advantages system-wide. One of the other factors of RAID 10 is that it has the ability to lose a lot of drives. If you have an 8-drive array with RAID 10, you can lose as many as 4 drives out of that. Now, because it's not a single large array, that loss of another drive is not always evenly distributed amongst the array. In a RAID 5 array, you can lose any 1 drive. In RAID 6, you can lose any 2 drives. In RAID 10, you can lose any 1. And then you can lose any 1 of any of these sets that isn't the one that already lost one. And then once you've lost those 2, you can lose any, the remaining sets. So there is always the possibility that you're going to lose a second drive, and it's going to be from from the very first set. And so RAID 10 can fail with as few as 2 drives failing, or as many as 50% of your total array. So RAID 10 actually becomes more reliable as the arrays get larger, unlike RAID 5 and RAID 6, which lose reliability, because as the array gets larger, the wear and tear per drive becomes lower, and the chances of a second failure are less likely, and if there is going to be a failure, it's going to be somewhere else in the array. So it's counterintuitive that larger arrays are more reliable. That's only the case within the same usage scenario. If you were to take two completely independent RAID 10 arrays, merge them together, and have twice as many systems hitting that same array, then you're going to bring up the wear and tear again, because so in comparison to other RAID levels, it's more reliable. In comparison to itself in different usage scenarios, it is not. So it depends on your perspective on that, how that actually plays out. But RAID 10 has the performance advantage and the reliability advantage in the real world, because the chances of RAID 10 being able to survive multiple drive failures is very high. If you look at an 8-drive array, if you lose one out of the remaining 7, you have 7 chances of drive failure, only one of which causes you to lose the array. So the chances are in a larger array, 10 or 12 or 14 drives, the chances are you would be able to lose 3 to 4 drives without losing the array pretty reliably. So it's in today's market, because of the cost effectiveness of drives today, because the prices have gone way down, and because the drives themselves are more reliable, RAID 1 and RAID 10 really become the de facto go-to choices for the small business market. These are the ones that make most sense most of the time. They cost slightly more than using RAID 5, but the reliability advantages and the speed advantages are so high that they almost always win out in a real comparison. RAID 5 does still have a place. RAID 6 does, but it's really kind of pushing its luck, in my opinion. It would be better to just have good backups, I think. But definitely in what I've seen, RAID 1 and 10 are more than 90% of the time the right choices. And if you're going to do any deployment where you're not spending a lot of time focused on your subsystems, they're a very, very reasonable way to go with very little chance of having picked something inappropriate for your environment, beyond sizing and having enough spindles for your needs. So other than that, there are RAID levels that are quirky, like RAID 100 is actually a RAID 0 stripe of many RAID 10 arrays, which has some really interesting performance characteristics because writes are asymmetric, which gives you a different wear and tear characteristic, which actually reduces the chance of failure in some scenarios because of the way that the load is being spread across the drives. But you're getting very large arrays and very, very expensive, so that typically doesn't apply in the small business environment. So that is pretty much the presentation, and I'm sure we want to do Q&A.
Can you actually lose one whole set, or you pretty much screwed if you lose just the one whole set
of RAID 10? If one of the mirrored pairs?
Yeah.
If one of the mirrored pairs in a RAID 10 set, in a RAID 10 array, if one of the mirrored 1 sets fails, the entire array has failed. Yes. So it's the same as, because it's RAID 0 that's striped over the top. So there's no redundancy once an entire set fails.
But the chances of an entire set failing are a lot less likely.
Right. If you had 5 RAID 1 mirrors and ran them all the time, the chances of any one of them failing is the same as a RAID 10 set of the same size failing, minus any differential caused by abnormal wear and tear on separate sets. Because RAID 10 makes it even, so you don't have one pair that's being hit much harder than the others. So there are advantages to it from a wear and tear perspective, but it's obviously almost background noise. Yeah?
What about on the controller side? For a large RAID 10, is there any considerations there? Because you talked earlier about controller failure being a bigger factor now.
So I'm not quite sure what the question is.
If you have
certain
controllers
that I'm sorry. In the same way that RAID 5 and RAID 6 are, RAID 10 does not suffer the risk of controller failure in the same way as 5 and 6. Is that the question?
Well, I mean, I'm assuming you're still using a single controller across the backplane or whatever.
Yes.
And so, controllers, when they fail, it's nice that they just die and don't corrupt data, but that's not always the case. What
Correct.
can you do to help mitigate that issue?
Backups. There are devices that allow you to have multiple controllers that are running in redundantly, but that is in a RAID 10 array that is so uncommon that even in the largest enterprise systems, I've never heard of anyone doing that. You've seen the biggest of any enterprise systems I know. Have you ever seen anybody do no? Well, the really big systems go to software RAID, so that's you're really kind of capped out at something like the HP 780G7, right? Is effectively the largest, and I'm sure Dell has an equivalent. I just don't know the number. Is the largest Intel class box on the market today. That at least that falls into a normal usage category, which is an 8 CPU. And so if you're getting that big, people still typically are looking at just one controller. You can do things when you're that big that you could have multiple controllers, but if you're doing like RAID 10 across them, any one controller goes, you're going to lose them all because you have that sensitivity. So it's yeah, not perfect, but we're kind of at some point there has to be a level of where the failure is going to be. So at that point is where you would want to go to a separate chassis that has your data redundantly there to protect against that. But a RAID controller failure with RAID 10, the chances of it failing and corrupting your data is extremely low. With RAID 5 and 6, they have destructive operations programmed into them, and that's where the risk comes from. They actively destroy data in certain situations, and RAID 10 never does. As long as it's actually operating in a RAID 1 or RAID 10 scenario, or RAID 0. Well, RAID 0 would do nothing. With RAID 1 or 10, when a drive fails and it believes another drive has been put in, it copies good data onto it, so it's a non-changing operation. That you have that one new drive is at risk, but the rest of the array is not. Whereas RAID 5 would change every drive.
What about spindle speeds for RAID 10 versus a RAID 5? I mean, could you go with the 7200 RPM and get the same performance as using 15K on a RAID 5? Or is that even?
You could. If you're going to do that, what you'd really be getting into calculating to discern exactly how many spindles you need. And their characteristics are different. So to get the read speed of a RAID 5, you would need fewer drives on RAID 10. But to get to the write speed, you might need the same number or a few more, depending on the size of the RAID 5 will really affect how the RAID, they have different curves, right? So finding the point where they cross or diverge would matter. If you're going to go something as dramatic as 7200s versus a 15K, you're getting twice roughly the IOPS coming from a 15K as a 7200. So you would definitely need more spindles on a RAID 10 doing that, but it could prove to be cost effective depending on exactly what you need to at least price that out. Typically, if you're looking at that, I would look at 10Ks versus 15Ks rather than dropping all the way to 7200s. But if you were looking at 10Ks versus 7200s, that's where it really potentially could be done. All right.
5.1.
Okay, so with 5.1, this is RAID 51. What you have is basically a RAID 10, except instead of a RAID 0 stripe connecting a set of RAID 1s, you have a RAID 5 set connecting a set of RAID 1s. This is generally only seen in fairly large servers, simply because it requires a minimum of 6 drives. And at 6 drives, you were in the same thing as the RAID 5 and 3 drives. It's not very effective, so you would be looking at a minimum of 10 to 12 drives before it started having a performance characteristic that was beneficial. Typically, you only see this on really large controllers, so you're looking typically at a minimum of something like a smart array, P400 or P410, with you'd really be wanting to have a minimum of a ½ gig cache and possibly a gig cache with WWDC to back that up. So it does have usage places where it makes sense because it does have a drive reliability advantage over RAID 10. but it has a big performance hit because it's got to do the RAID 5 stripe of those mirrors, and it does have the risk of the controller failure taking it out, but you're especially when you're working with 51, you're on really large enterprise controllers, so you're really never going to see that on a low-end controller, which in theory lowers your risk. However, I've only seen failures on high-end enterprise controllers, so but that may be completely anecdotal.
It only breaks in a big hit.
Right, exactly. Well, they're the ones who run the most and have the most of them. So it's so 51 is not very often seen. I think falls into a niche market, but it does, especially if you have an extremely large number of drives, where when you get large enough, the chances of drive failures happening gets higher. It does give you some reliability, and you can lose any one mirrored set within the group. Yeah.
I'll throw one in just for the add-on. When you're using drives in the SAS range, the 10K, 15K, do you always get better performance out of the 15K over the 10K, or are there actually instances and configurations where you can actually save the money and still get better performance than the 15K drive?
You can definitely save money by going with a slower drive as your drive of choice, but as far as getting better performance within, if you're dealing with arrays that are the same, X number of drives, this type of array, you're always going to get better performance from the faster drive. But if it's a real-world money matters situation, it often makes sense to look at, say, if you're looking at 6 15K drives, to price out 8 or 10 10K drives. You could very easily, depending on your RAID level, depending on which factors are most important to you, you could very easily gain capacity, gain or equal performance while cutting costs. It depends on the prices of drives at the moment, which vendors you're working with. It's very price sensitive, but that definitely happens, and it's something that fairly commonly I see as something that makes sense for small businesses to always look at, because quite often the price differential is very large. 10Ks could be half the cost almost of 15K. And the other thing that of course you can do along the same lines is, instead of looking at spindle speed, look at sizes. If you're convinced you need 6 300 gig drives, consider 12 160 gig drives, because you're going to double your spindle count while keeping the capacity, and it's every possibility that the cost is going to be almost exactly the same. And so it's almost free performance, and all you have to do is put more of them in. So that's often a place where you can gain a lot. And a lot of really big enterprises today are still deploying 72 and 144 gig drives because of that. They care about cheap performance. They don't care too much about capacity. So large numbers of small drives is often the way to go. Is that it? I think we're kind of pushing hard to get questions. Yeah. Are we raining out there?
No. I think it's just about.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.